Hello everyone, my name is Aurélien Acquier. I'm a professor of sustainability at ESCP Business School and I'm co-director of the chair in circular economy. In this video I'm going to talk about the context of circular economy, and to do that I will introduce the notion of Anthropocene, which is very important in order to capture the evolution of our relationship with nature and the new context we live in terms of natural resources. And we're also going to discuss the problems related to linear economy business models. When we talk about circular economy, maybe the starting point is that humanity is hitting on the limits of ecosystems. What you see on this picture is a picture of biodiversity erosion related to deforestation. Deforestation in Indonesia here, where forests are replaced by palm oil plantations. Actually, this problem of deforestation has a huge impact on biodiversity, and a recent report from IPBES UN group on biodiversity is saying that actually we are in the middle of the sixth massive extinction of species today, with more than 60% of living species that are threatened, right? The question behind this is the ability of humans also to survive in this new context. Also, deforestation, as you may know, is related to global warming. And global warming is also a huge challenge that our societies are facing today. Here in this graph, what you see is the CO2 emissions from 1970s to 2020. What we see on the graph is a constant rise in CO2 emissions in our societies. And we see also what would be needed to achieve, to remain within the objectives of the Paris Agreement. So actually, we would need to reach carbon neutrality between 2040 to 2055. To do that, we really need a resource revolution. This resource revolution will be threefold. First, we must refrain from exploiting half of the available carbon energy on Earth. Secondly, we need to decarbonize the pool of energy that we are using. And thirdly, we need to dramatically raise the resource efficiency of our economic system to be able to perform the same kind of services with much lower energy, and eventually to decrease as well the total amount of energy we use. This is obviously a very important challenge because well, we actually don't know what a +4 degree would mean for our societies and businesses, right? As Henri de Castries, former CEO of AXA, said, a 2-degree world might be insurable, but a 4-degree world certainly wouldn't be. Well, it means that if we go beyond the 2 degrees, we are stepping into the unknown, and we actually cannot predict the type of environment we will live in. Actually, the thing is, and also the transformation we are seeing today should warn us. We have already experienced a global warming of 1.1 degrees since the first industrial revolution, and the consequences are already visible today, right? A concrete example is the fact that Indonesia decided to move its capital from Jakarta to the island of Borneo. And this is because actually the island is sinking into the ocean because of water elevation, ocean elevation. To understand what a 4-degree scenario would mean, we have to step back in time, right? If we look at the evolution of the average temperature on Earth, what we see on the graph is the evolution between 80,000 years before our epoch until today, right? And we are currently living in a kind of in a period that has been very favorable for human life, which is called the Holocene. And the Holocene has been marked by a stabilization of temperature around, on average, 15 degrees. and this created a very favorable context for human civilizations, because actually this period, which started 12,000 years ago, was marked by the development of the agriculture, the ability of the population to sedentarize in different parts of the world, to develop agriculture, and to develop also industries, etc., etc. Well, here what we see is that before, actually, the Holocene succeeded to another glaciation period, right? And in this glaciation period, the average temperature was 4 to 5 degrees lower, right? And in this situation, most of Europe was actually covered by ice and glaciers. So this is, and also the water, the ocean level was 126 meters below what it is today. So, well, actually the ecosystem was much more hostile and to human life in this situation. We're talking here about the difference of minus 4 to 5 degrees. So you can imagine the importance of what a plus 4 to 5 degrees would mean. It's something we have never experienced, and we really don't know about the potential consequences. So it's a real change in civilization. The thing is that these problems have actually accelerated since the 1945. Observers talk about the great acceleration, where when you look at different indicators, it can be Earth system indicators or socio-economic indicators, then you see explosion in many of these indicators. Population growth, of course. We are nearly 8 billion on Earth today, real GDP evolution, foreign direct investment, urban population, primary energy use, well, and Earth ecosystem trends follow the same route, right? So you see here the evolution of carbon dioxide emissions, nitrous oxide, methane, etc., etc. The evolution of the surface, the evolution of ocean acidification, etc. This tendency is so strong that actually there have been many calls to really integrate that our relationship with the environment is radically changing. Crutzen, a Nobel Prize in Physics, introduced the notion of Anthropocene, just to explain that we have entered into a new era where men are actually the dominating force on our ecosystems, right? So it's not nature shaping nature through geological eras. Actually, men have become a major force in geological transformation and biological transformations. So what Crutzen proposed is to consider that we are today out of the Holocene period, this period of stabilization of the temperature. We are now in a different period where the influence of men on ecosystem has become so strong that men become their own context, and that it becomes extremely important for men to be able to limit or to consider the impact of their development on their ecosystems. Crutzen is not the only one to say that, of course. If you look at the history on social sciences, you have also many reflections related to that, right? Hans Jonas, for example, the German philosopher, in the 70s already developed the idea of the imperative of responsibility. And his argument was that since we've entered into this era where man can destruct the ecosystem and destruct itself through the atomic technology, for example, the atomic bomb, then it completely reshapes our relationship with nature, and we must be able to develop a new ethic for that. And we must be able to think about the technologies we would develop or we would not develop because they are too risky, right? So actually you have several works and several streams explaining that our relationship with nature is completely transforming and that we need to revise our philosophical system, but also our economic system. To illustrate this notion of Anthropocene, I like to use a metaphor, which is that we have moved from what I call an empty world to a crowded world. Where, what does this mean? Actually, Roughly until the 50s, human could figure out that they were living in an empty world where actually man is embedded in a context, the natural context that surrounds him, and that he has to domesticate in order to survive. And in this model, nature puts limits on human development. And actually, if you read, for example, the Bible and the Old Testament, you will see that this vision of nature as something that is adversarial, that the humans have to domesticate in order to survive, is very, very strong, actually. In this empty world also, nature is everywhere and is kind of infinite. And so man has a marginal impact on the dynamics of ecosystem. So actually, if you make an impact on the ecosystem, it doesn't count because ecosystems are so big that actually at the whole level system, it won't be a serious impact, right? In this model, you can make the hypothesis that nature is infinite and that it can also be appropriated and owned, right? And it is kind of a context that is external, where man don't transform or affect. In this model from an economic system as well, economic frontiers are local, national, with limited interdependencies, and economy and business models are linear, and we will come on that problem in a minute, right? The problem is that these hypotheses were okay roughly until the 50s, but what we've experienced since then is the rise, the tremendous rise of the human impact on the ecosystems, and this is a radical change. So we no longer can make the hypothesis of an empty world. We now live in a crowded world in which population has exploded and nature has been domesticated. It's very, very difficult today to find places where nature is not affected by or untouched by human activities, right? And in this situation, what we observe is that resources start to become scarce, with questions related, for example, to water availability, sand availability, the availability also of raw materials to produce batteries, to shift automobile industry to electric, for example. And so natural limits are reached, right? In this crowded world as well, mankind has a major impact on global ecosystem dynamics. We can think here of CO2 emissions. We can think as well to pollution, to nuclear energy that we discussed, etc., right? So the idea that nature is infinite and can be appropriated is no longer relevant. Nature is finite, and it is increasingly to be viewed as a common milieu that we need to preserve. And this involves, of course, a very radical shift in the way, in the law of nature, right? And we need to invent new regulations to protect these commons. Another difference between the empty world and the crowded world is that crowded world is also crowded because economies are highly interdependent. And if you think about the concepts we use in management, you've heard, of course, about the international division of labor, the idea of a global village or of global value chains, which means that actually everything is intricated and economic activities are integrated at the global level. And in this situation, business models need to become circular and limit drastically their externalities, and we will develop that later on, right? The problem is that our economic and social institutions were all designed in an empty world, right? We come from societies that were built on the hypothesis of the empty world. I was mentioning the Bible, and so we could talk about Occidental religion and the vision to nature. But another manifestation of that is economics, right? Economics were framed in an empty world, right? At a time where we could make the hypothesis that nature was infinite. And actually, economic institutions don't take into account nature. If you think about the history of economics, here I took a sentence from Jean-Baptiste Say, who was obviously writing in an empty world, right? And he opened his political economy treaty, by this sentence, natural resources are infinite and inexhaustible, because without this property, we would not get them for free. As they cannot be multiplied, renewed, nor exhausted, they are not an issue for economics, right? So this is crystal clear about the fact that economics, when it was formed, didn't take into account natural impact, right? Because there was this postulate made here by Jean-Baptiste Say that nature was infinite and couldn't be valued. The second problem is that, well, we could think that actually it's easy to fix and to integrate that. But actually, topics such as climate change or biodiversity erosion pose a very strong challenge in terms of adaptation and in terms also of perception. Here I took a cartoon showing like two scientists looking at the coronavirus, right? And here you have the graph that we have all seen on the coronavirus about the evolution of the cases of coronavirus versus what the health system can cope with. And well, two people say, well, I'll be happy when this is over. And of course, they don't see the wave of climate change coming, and this wave may be much more threatening for them, actually. So maybe they should turn there. And so how don't we perceive climate change? Where there are many reasons for that, and many studies have been exploring this question. If you read French, a very good synthesis was done by Sébastien Boller in his book Le Bug Humain, the human bug, why our brain forces us to destroy planet and how to prevent it from doing it. Actually, yeah, what these work show is that actually one problem with climate change is that it raises very strong perception problems. As a human species, we're accustomed to react on immediate problems that are immediately threatening, right? When, for example, you cross the street and you will be bumped by a bike or a car, etc., then you have a completely radical transformation of your metabolism to put you in a situation of alert and react. Right? This is not the case with climate change because the process is very progressive, right? And we cannot, we have difficulty feeling it. We have to measure it, but it's difficult to experience it as it occurs, right? We have already experienced a 1 degree warming since the first industrial revolution, but it's a long time, it's progressive, and so difficult to perceive. And actually, you may know of this metaphor of the boiling frog, right? Which is that if you put a frog into boiling water, then it will do all it can to escape, right? Because there is a radical difference between the temperature of the boiling water and its environment. But if you put it into cold water, where the frog is cool, and you start to boil it little by little, then the frog will fall asleep and die peacefully being boiled, right? And well, actually this is being used as a metaphor to show that we are not accustomed to reacting to progressive change. We need radical change to react, right? There are also different aspects, but the combination of these two problems, economic institutions not taking into account natural resources, plus difficulty to change, creates a situation where we are stuck in a linear economy model, right? And what is the linear economy? Which will be a very important concept for our further discussions. Well, the idea of the linear economy is the model that served as a template to structure our business model since the first industrial revolution. To build a chair or a table or a shelf or anything, you need first raw materials, here wood, right? When you have extracted raw materials, then you need to produce and transport them, then you need to distribute them through stores, and then you go and buy them, you use them, and well, you waste and destruct when you've used it, right? If it's possible. This model is a take, make, dispose that characterize the linear economy. It's called cradle to the grave manufacturing model. So the cradle is here and the grave is here. and it dates back to the Industrial Revolution, right? The problem is that in this model, in order to create value, you are creating value at different steps: raw material extraction, production, distribution, and waste, because to treat the waste, you also have economic actors that are going to treat them, to bury them, to burn them, to recycle them eventually. But actually, waste and destruction is also a step where profit is made, right? The only step where you don't create economic value in this system is the use stage, right? Where you're creating utility because the consumer is using the product, but you're not creating financial value, right? And so how do you maximize value creation in this model? Well, by taking the arrow as fast as you can. And to do that, you certainly know business model that try to reduce the use stage and to increase the number of purchasing that you're going to do. And we'll come to that there in a minute. Before we go to that, who is in charge of waste in this system? Well, actually, the problem is passed over every step of the model. And when you're a final customer, you are in charge of the waste, right? It's not the producer or the distributor that is being responsible for it. So it creates also a big incentive problem. And as we will see, this linear paradigm is creating a lot of problems currently. Since we didn't change the way we measure value, and since we didn't change also the way we take into account nature and externalities, well, actually, linear economy systems are contributing to the great acceleration. So here I just took a case of the evolution of smartphone industry from 2010 to 2017. We see the increase of the average rise of these apparels and the increased technologization, increased technology that is put into these small items. And here you can view like how in 13 years, actually, the evolution of smartphones sold in the world. So it's a product that didn't exist 15 years ago, and today there are more than 1,500,000,000 units sold every year, right? So 1,500,000,000 units. Let's recall also that the world population is averaging 8 billion today, and that there are today more mobile connections than people on Earth, right? So this is giving you an idea of how fast the diffusion of technological products can be in linear economy systems, right? If you think about entrepreneurship, well, also think about the models that are promoted in your entrepreneurship courses, right? When you're in entrepreneurship, you always try to become a licorn, right? And you have different bestseller books in entrepreneurship that talks about explosive growth. Of course, no reference with the nature and environment here, or blitz scaling, meaning how do you achieve extremely fast growth to develop startup and markets extremely fast, right? So what is the result of all this? Since our economic systems didn't integrate environmental externalities, what we see today is that some very profitable business models generate very high environmental and social externalities, right? I am sure you've heard about debates related to planned obsolescence, right? So, for example, you may know that these small items, their average life are 2 years, right? About 2 years today. And actually, the thing is that the pace of innovation brings people to renew their equipment sooner, because in order to keep it functioning, you have to renew it sooner, and it's difficult to upgrade it, so you have to buy a new one, right? Another example is the cartridge industry. You may have seen this in your strategy course, by the way, where actually many strategy professors promote business model based on consumables, where actually you will sell a printer for free or I mean, without making any profit, but the profit will be done on consumables, the cartridge and the ink, which is actually generating most of the profit in this industry, right? And it means that you, as a company, are incentivized to sub-optimize the thing to make the product last not as long and to sub-optimize the economic system, right? Another example of this business model which generate high environmental and social impacts is the sector of fast fashion. You may have seen, like in 2017, a movie about the fast fashion industry called The True Cost, where the documentary developed the environmental and social impact of the fast fashion industry. Likewise, we could also think about business model where, for example, instead of buying bulk coffee, you are buying parcels. And well, all the packaging cost that is induced by this kind of business model can be huge, even if you find ways to recycle these capsules. The thing is that with this linear economy business model, with this type of growth, we of course contribute to go beyond the ecosystem bearing capacities. A good example of that is plastics, right? So you may have heard about the issue of plastics, but there was a study from Ellen MacArthur Foundation last year about the evolution of plastics. And actually what you see is that we use in 2014 20 times as much plastic as we did in the 60s, right? And so there has been this exponential growth in the use of plastics. And the problem with plastics is that if you try to make a material flow analysis, meaning that you are questioning where the plastic comes from and where it goes, actually the figures are not very reassuring. Today, 98% of the plastic is virgin plastic, right? It means it comes from oil sources, right? Out of the 78 million tons we use every year, only 15%, 14% exactly of the plastic gets collected. Out of this 14%, 4% goes to process losses, 8% is recycled but is downcycled, means that the property of the recycled material is not as good as a virgin one, and only 2% is closed loop recycling, meaning that it can be used for the same purpose as virgin plastic. Right, so here it shows that actually recycling plastic is is still problematic today because of the collection and also of the downcycling problem. Now, what's happening with the rest? Well, actually 14% of the remaining quantities go to incineration. They get burned and eventually energy recovered, but it's going to be burnt. 40% of it goes to landfill, right, which raise problem in landfill capacities actually. And 32% is leakage. It means that 1/3 of the plastic we use every year goes into nature and is unaccounted, right? Well, what happened with the landfill? Well, until 2017, it was exported to China, but China then closed its frontiers because it didn't want to have too much waste, and it had a problem of capacity in its own landfill, right? So actually what's happening today is that this situation created big international issues. For example, the US was exporting a lot of waste, plastic waste to China, and then in different cities in the US, the cost for recycling raised a lot, which brought some cities to stop recycling, right? So it didn't solve the problem, right? Another example of the problems it raises is Hong Kong. So Hong Kong has used to export also most of its plastic waste to China, and the problem with Hong Kong is that the landfill capacity is very limited, and so the city is currently facing big problems with this issue on how to manage this plastic problem. And so you may have heard that new importing countries such as Indonesia have developed since then, but this is a very, very important international problem today, right? You may think that, well, okay, we have this problem today of how do we manage this waste and the plastic waste, but this will stimulate innovation. Maybe the recycling will become more expensive, but we have to do it and it will make the industry profitable. And that's partly true, but there is also a big problem, which is who is going to pay the bill at the end of the day. And here I think we need to take into account the social acceptability of the increased cost and who is going to pay for the cost. Keep in mind that in France, the protest against the Gilets jaunes movement was born after the eco-tax that was to be created on oil and gasoline, right? And so here it raises the problem of the acceptability and the ability of people to pay for it, right? And so the social acceptability of circular economy measures. Okay, so now that we have set the scene and that we have discussed the fact that our economic system are hitting ecosystem abilities, how do we react to this new situation of Anthropocene? How do we react to this new environment? Well, actually, there are different typical responses that I would like to elaborate quickly. I think it's critically important that as managers you avoid two extreme situations. First one would be blindness, and the other extreme situation is doom and fatalism. Blindness, I'm sure you see what I mean. Like, it's about collective and individual denial, right? And putting our head in the sand and saying that everything is just fine. Of course, we have many examples of that according to climate change. We said that change is very difficult because it's gradual, and so also it's difficult to perceive, and there are very many people who just don't want to see it. And examples of that abound at the political level. There were controversies about different countries, but also lately there were discussions about what's going on in Australia as well, right? And individual and collective denial may be political, it may be also managerial, right? If you look at CEOs, a very interesting study is being done every year by PricewaterhouseCoopers, and what the study asks is how CEOs perceive threats and risks. And here is the stats for 2019 and 2020. And actually, if you look for the biggest perceived threats by CEO, you see that the first one is over-regulation, trade conflicts, uncertain economic growth will certainly become negative actually in the coming month, policy uncertainties, etc. But actually, speed of technological change, uncertain economic growth, climate change, as you see, is really one of, it's not perceived as one of the most salient issues. And of course, biodiversity, I think, wouldn't be perceived as very important either. So actually here in 2020, there is a small uptake of climate change and environmental damage, but you see that it's still far below the top perceived risks within CEOs, and that's a key issue, right? So, second extreme, which is not completely radically opposite to the first one of denial, is to consider that actually collapse is inevitable, and that given the evolution on the pressures on our ecosystems, there is one thing to be sure, which is that we will have to face environmental collapse. And actually this is also a big issue because it's big inhibitors for action, because if you postulate that everything is doomed and that there is no way out, then it's not stimulating action. The only thing that you can do is try to withdraw and to take the eggs out of the basket, but it's very difficult to imagine types of action and to drive positive energy around collapsology, and that's quite a big issue. Another type of reaction that we are all familiar with, especially they are very popular in the business and engineering environment, is the idea of technological innovation, which we could label technological utopia, because there is also this belief that we are faced with huge challenges, but technology will be the answer. Well, actually, it's both a very motivating rationale, it's a very motivating discourse, but you have also to remind of the limits of this approach, right? For example, here, if we take the case of Tesla, which is making the bet that it will shift the whole transportation industry to electric. Well, this is good on paper, but of course it creates issues related to displacing the problem. Like, you don't emit, if you use, for example, a vehicle car, you're not emitting when you're using it, but you're displacing the emissions on the production of the electricity, right? If you produce electricity with coal, for example, then you are emitting the CO2 at the production stage instead of the use stage. Other problems also in the life cycle of the product is what do you do with the batteries at the end of life? And also, how do you supply with the rare earth minerals that are necessary to produce the battery, that are limited in availability, and that may create new types of dependencies, right? So big intake here is technological innovation is very motivating, but it also raises additional problems that need to be taken into account. It's no magical wand, right? Another approach is social and cultural innovation. And in this perspective, the idea is that actually you can rebuild system at the local level through different types of innovation with local communities, etc., etc. A good illustration of this logic is the movie Demain, that was a huge success in France in 2015, and that was trying to show alternative approaches to agriculture, such as permaculture, etc. We could think as well on social business, social entrepreneurship initiatives, or all the movement that try to rethink corporate governance with purpose-driven corporations, which both try to achieve financial sustainability, but also promote a mission and integrate a social purpose at the core of the governance of the structure. So you may know of B Corporation or this type of initiatives. Last rationale, which I think is very important, is business model innovation, which is to say that actually we have to reconstruct business according to this strong sustainability perspective, where business is embedded into society, which is embedded into natural ecosystem. And for that, circular economy is the perfect illustration of business model innovation. So what is circular economy? It's a set of business models and practices to create economic value while minimizing waste and better utilizing resources. The idea behind circular economy is to decouple growth from the consumption of finite resources. And as we will see, a lot of it is related to taking inspiration from nature and through biomimicry, for example. I would like to conclude this video by what is the way forward and how do we rebuild social and economic systems for resilience in the era of Anthropocene. So first, I think you should remember from this video that Anthropocene marks a new era in our relationship with nature, right? I'm sure you're all familiar with the classic way of framing sustainability, right? Sustainability with the idea to combine economic development or economic growth with social performance and environmental performance. This model is the classic corporate sustainability perspective, and it's about reaching reasonable compromise, right? It's trying to limit the economic externalities and trying to compromise with environmental and social value. I think what the Anthropocene is telling us is that we need a model that is more radical, where actually all economic activities are embedded within society and all societies are embedded into natural ecosystem. And actually, They interact all the time. Economy, society, and natural ecosystem are interacting all the time in retroactive and complex ways, right? Natural ecosystems sustain life, sustain the ability of society and economic system to thrive, and economic and society systems, retroactively, they impact dramatically on the natural ecosystems. So Anthropocene is about the embeddedness and interrelationship between mankind and nature. So this is very important, I think, from a conceptual point of view. So now it should be clear that we need a paradigmatic change, and of course the following question is where to start, right? Of course, we can wait for international coordination to happen, but we have to start from something more concrete. And a concrete way is to think about how to fix economic and managerial tools. First aspect is that we need to change really economic tools. We've seen that we have a problem with the way we measure growth in the economic system, the way our economic system is not taking into account nature today. And so we really need to move from indicators such as gross domestic product, which doesn't take at all the impact on natural losses, to other types of indicators. Maybe we need plural indicators, and a good approach to do it is to focus on planetary boundaries. We can do that an initiative for that was proposed by Kate Raworth in her donut economy approach. And what she proposes is to build a system where we measure well-being on different dimensions. At the top level here of the donut are planetary boundaries, the 8 planetary boundaries, and we need to keep growth within the limits of planetary boundaries, right? And we must prevent from reaching the ceiling. And the problem today is that we have already reached the ceiling on different planetary boundaries. But we need also to take into account social justice and the fact that the value should be shared not too unequally among people. And so it's in this sweet spot between social justice and environmental overshoot that we must build our future growth and future prosperity, right? This is, of course, at the macroeconomic level, and it's very important to shift the way we measure value at that level. But it can also be done, and it must also be done within corporation. Think of financial accounting, right? Financial accounting today is only taking into account financial capital, right? And actually, we should take into consideration other type of capital. As we have seen through this presentation, nature is a fundamental capital, a fundamental resource on which we build our life and activities. So we must use the system of depreciation, for example, to say that if you exploit natural resources, you should have like a financial depreciation system to rebuild the natural capacity to regenerate itself, right? It means a complete revolution in the financial accounting tools. And this is something that we must urgently do if we're serious about Anthropocene and circular economy, right? Another aspect on where to start is fixing strategic making. We really need some more prospective thinking in strategy about how we anticipate risks, how we build scenarios, and how we enact resilience in the new era of Anthropocene. So you must start from a good understanding of planetary boundaries, what are the threats we are confronted with today, and how do you project your company in this new situation, actually. And then what type of collective action would be needed to try to prevent the scenarios you don't want to see, right? Another aspect related to strategy is to really have the tool to redesign business model for circular economy. And this is like what we are going to do in the next stages of this elective. Rethinking corporate governance as well is a necessary debate today, and there are different initiatives to do that. But really importantly, to finish with strategy making, we need also a shift from competitive rivalry to more collective coordination. It means that if companies are serious when they want to address global problems, they must build new cooperative relationships, at least at the level of the industry and with governments and with external stakeholders, to be better able to value externalities, but collectively, otherwise it has no sense, and also protect the commons collectively. So like it's a collective resource that is useful for all and that is not appropriated by each and every actor. Okay. Of course, we see that the challenge is huge, and to do that also we talked about awareness of the issue, and well, there is a lot also to do to fix business school education. I think what we really need to do for that is to first think of a stress test for the Anthropocene of existing functions and existing teaching within business school. So, for example, when you think about human resources, are people trained to understand the process of climate change and the issues it represents? In marketing, well, actually, how do you rethink marketing for sobriety? How do you adapt finance tools to redress the economy and stimulate non-carbon energies, for example? How do you fix innovation to prevent some innovation that are particularly damaging for the environment to be developed? And strategy, we already discussed that, right? But there is many things to do across every discipline to integrate these topics. Next to that, there are new skills to reinforce. First, understanding the grand challenges that we're confronted with. Second, dealing with uncertainty and complexity. Dealing with systemic thinking, trying to understand and understanding how ecosystems function. Dealing with paradoxes and ethical issues, critical and personal thinking. And also we need new types of creativity to build new imaginaries, right? We also need to open management to new fields of knowledge, such as to understand interdisciplinary issues such as climate change, biodiversity losses, etc., etc. And management, develop the discussions between management, natural sciences, social sciences, and understand the sociological, political challenges raised by the Anthropocene, and also develop discussions with design and arts. So you see that here there is a long way to transform the business school, but I hope that this video was useful to spot the grand challenges and understand what's ahead of us. Thank you very much, and see you soon.